two young black brothers went missing in 1970. 40 years later, their story shocked the world. The summer of 1970 was supposed to be like any other in Millfield, Georgia. Children played barefoot in dusty yards while their mothers hung laundry on sagging clotheslines. But for 9-year-old Malcolm Carter, that Tuesday afternoon would split his life into two halves, before and after. "Mama, something's wrong with David!" Malcolm's voice cracked with panic as he burst through the screen door of their small rental house. Behind him, 7-year-old David stumbled, his small frame trembling like a leaf in a storm. Loretta Carter dropped the dish towel she'd been holding and rushed to her youngest son. One touch of his forehead told her everything she needed to know. David's skin burned like hot coals, and his eyes had that glassy, distant look that made her stomach twist with fear. "Oh, sweet Jesus," she whispered, scooping David into her arms. The boy's head lolled against her shoulder, and she could feel the heat radiating through his thin t-shirt. At 25, Loretta had already seen too much hardship. Her husband's death in Vietnam 2 years prior had left her to raise two boys alone while working double shifts at the textile factory. But nothing had prepared her for this moment. Malcolm tugged at her arm. "Mama, is David gonna be okay? He was fine this morning, and then he just..." His voice trailed off as tears welled in his dark eyes. "Get the car keys from the kitchen counter," Loretta commanded, her voice steadier than she felt. "We're going to Dr. Henderson's clinic right now." The drive to the clinic felt like an eternity. David's breathing grew more labored with each passing minute, and Malcolm held his little brother's hand from the back seat, whispering reassurances that he didn't quite believe himself. "It's gonna be alright, David. Mama's gonna fix you up real good." Dr. Henderson, a kind elderly man who'd been treating the black community for decades, took one look at David and shook his head grimly. "Loretta, this boy needs more than I can give him here. His fever's spiking dangerous high, and I'm hearing something in his chest that concerns me greatly." "What do you mean?" Loretta's voice barely rose above a whisper. "St. Mary's Regional Hospital. It's about 2 hours north. They've got the specialists and equipment David needs. My clinic just isn't equipped for this level of care." Dr. Henderson's weathered hands moved quickly as he checked David's pulse again. "I'm calling for an ambulance right now." Loretta felt the world tilt beneath her feet. 2 hours away? She couldn't leave her job for that long. She'd already used up her sick days when David had the flu last month. The factory supervisor had made it clear that any more absences could cost her the job that barely kept them afloat. "Can I drive him myself?" she asked, but Dr. Henderson was already shaking his head. "This child needs medical attention during transport. His condition could worsen at any moment." The doctor paused, studying her face. "The ambulance crew will take good care of him, Loretta. St. Mary's will call you the moment he's admitted." When the ambulance arrived, its red lights casting eerie shadows through the clinic windows, Malcolm surprised everyone by stepping forward. "I'm going with David." "Malcolm, honey, you need to stay here with Mama," Loretta began, but her eldest son's expression was more determined than she'd ever seen it. "No, Mama. David's scared, and he needs his big brother. I won't let him go alone." Malcolm's 9-year-old voice carried a conviction that made the adults pause. "Besides, you gotta work tomorrow, and David's gonna need someone to read to him and make sure he eats his vegetables." The paramedic, a middle-aged white man with kind eyes, nodded approvingly. "Sometimes having family close can make all the difference in a child's recovery. We'll take good care of both boys." Loretta's heart ached as she watched her sons being loaded into the ambulance. David, semi-conscious and wrapped in white blankets, looked so small on the stretcher. Malcolm sat beside him, holding his brother's hand with fierce protectiveness that reminded her painfully of their father. "I'll call the hospital every hour," she promised, leaning into the ambulance for one last kiss on each boy's forehead. "You take care of each other, you hear me? I'll be up there first thing tomorrow morning." "We will, Mama," Malcolm said solemnly. "Don't worry about us." As the ambulance pulled away, its siren wailing into the humid southern night, Loretta stood in the clinic parking lot until the red lights disappeared around a bend. She had no way of knowing that those would be the last words she'd hear from her sons for 40 years. The drive back to her empty house felt like a nightmare. Every room echoed with the boy's absence. Malcolm's comic books scattered on the living room floor, David's stuffed rabbit forgotten on his rumpled bed. Loretta clutched the rabbit to her chest and tried to pray, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. At St. Mary's Regional Hospital, chaos reigned. What had started as a routine evening shift had exploded into pandemonium when 3 more ambulances arrived within minutes of each other, all carrying children with similar symptoms. The summer virus outbreak had hit the rural communities hard, overwhelming the already understaffed night crew. Nurse Patricia Williams, barely 6 months out of nursing school, found herself juggling more patients than she'd ever handled. The emergency room buzzed with activity as doctors shouted orders and worried parents filled the waiting area. In the confusion, small details began to slip through the cracks, details that would prove catastrophic. Malcolm held David's hand as they were wheeled through the hospital's sterile corridors. The bright fluorescent lights made David's skin look even paler, and Malcolm felt a fear deeper than anything he'd ever experienced. This wasn't like the scary movies they watched on Saturday afternoons. This was real, and his little brother might not be okay. "Don't worry, David," he whispered, even though he wasn't sure if his brother could hear him. "Mama will be here tomorrow, and we'll all go home together. You just gotta get better first." But as the hours ticked by and the hospital staff rushed from one emergency to another, a clerical error was about to set in motion a chain of events that would separate the Carter brothers from their mother and each other for decades. In the overwhelming chaos of that night, 2 young boys would disappear into a system that would forget they ever existed, until one determined paralegal decided to look closer at a box of dusty files 40 years later. The seeds of an unimaginable tragedy were planted in those frantic hours, when good people making small mistakes would create a wound in one family that would take 4 decades to heal. Loretta Carter barely slept that Tuesday night. Every creak of the old house made her think of her boys, and by 5 a.m., she was already dressed and ready to drive to St. Mary's Hospital. She'd called in sick to work, a decision that would cost her dearly later, but nothing mattered more than being with David and Malcolm. The phone rang at 6:30 a.m., startling her as she poured coffee with shaking hands. "Mrs. Carter? This is St. Mary's Regional Hospital calling about your son's admission last night." Loretta's heart leaped. Finally, news about David's condition. "Yes, how is he? How's David doing?" There was a long pause on the other end. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but we don't have any record of a David Carter being admitted to our facility." The coffee mug slipped from Loretta's fingers, shattering against the linoleum floor. "What do you mean? The ambulance took both my boys there last night. David Carter and Malcolm Carter. Dr. Henderson arranged it himself. Let me check again." The voice on the phone sounded genuinely confused. "I'm showing no, ma'am. We have no patients by those names. Are you sure they came to St. Mary's?" Loretta's world began to spin. "Of course I'm sure. The ambulance driver said they were taking them to St. Mary's Regional. My David had a high fever, and Malcolm went with him. They have to be there. Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but I'm looking at our admission logs from last night, and there's no record of either child. Perhaps there was a miscommunication about which hospital." Loretta slammed the phone down and grabbed her car keys. This was impossible. She'd watched her sons disappear into that ambulance with her own eyes. They had to be at St. Mary's. The 2-hour drive felt like the longest journey of her life. Loretta pressed the gas pedal harder than she ever had, her mind racing with increasingly frantic thoughts. Maybe it was just a clerical error. Maybe the boys were registered under different names somehow. There had to be a logical explanation. St. Mary's Regional Hospital was a sprawling brick building that looked more intimidating in daylight than she'd imagined. Loretta rushed through the main entrance, her heart pounding as she approached the information desk. "I need to find my sons," she said breathlessly to the receptionist. "David and Malcolm Carter. They were brought here last night by ambulance." The middle-aged white woman behind the desk typed something into her computer, frowning at the screen. I'm not showing any Carters in our system. What time did they arrive? Around 9 o'clock. David had a high fever, and Malcolm came with him. The paramedic said, Ma'am, I've checked every admission from last night. There's no record of your children ever being here. The receptionist's tone was becoming impatient. Are you certain you have the right hospital? Desperation clawed at Loretta's chest. Can I speak to someone else? A doctor? A supervisor? Please, my babies are here somewhere. For the next 3 hours, Loretta was passed from person to person. Each hospital employee looked at her with the same mixture of confusion and growing suspicion. The emergency room's supervisor checked the logs twice. The head nurse reviewed every patient file from the previous night. Even the ambulance dispatch records showed no transport to St. Mary's for children matching her son's descriptions. Mrs. Carter, the hospital administrator finally said, his voice gentle but firm. I understand you're worried about your children, but they were never brought to this facility. Perhaps you should contact the police if you believe your sons are missing. Loretta's legs nearly gave out beneath her. Missing? They're not missing. They were taken by ambulance. I saw them leave. But even as she spoke the words, she could see the doubt creeping into the administrator's eyes. The same look she'd seen on the receptionist's face, and the supervisor's face, and every other person she'd begged for help. They thought she was lying. Or worse, they thought she was mentally unstable. The drive to the Millfield Police Department was a blur of tears and disbelief. Deputy Sheriff Carl Morrison, a heavy-set man in his 50s, listened to Loretta's story with barely concealed skepticism. Let me get this straight, he said, leaning back in his creaky chair. You sent your 2 boys to a hospital in an ambulance, but now the hospital says they were never there, and you can't produce any paperwork or witnesses to back up your story? Dr. Henderson will tell you. He called the ambulance himself. But when Deputy Morrison called Dr. Henderson's clinic, the receptionist informed him that the doctor was out of town at a medical conference and wouldn't return for a week. The clinic had no record of the ambulance call in their hastily kept logs. Mrs. Carter, Morrison said, his tone growing more condescending, I've seen this before. Sometimes when folks are under stress, financial stress, maybe trouble at home, children might run away, and parents create stories to explain their absence. My boys didn't run away. Loretta's voice cracked with desperation. David was burning up with fever. He couldn't even walk. Morrison made a note in his file. We'll keep an eye out for them, but in cases like this, kids usually come home on their own within a few days. Over the following weeks, Loretta became a woman possessed. She drove to every hospital within a 100-mile radius. She created handmade flyers with Malcolm and David's school pictures, posting them on every telephone pole and store window that would allow it. She called radio stations, begging them to broadcast her son's descriptions. But whispers began to follow her around Millfield. Neighbors started crossing the street to avoid her desperate pleas for help. The textile factory supervisor, tired of her absences and erratic behavior, finally let her go. Loretta's lost her mind. People whispered at the grocery store. Those boys probably ran off because she wasn't taking proper care of them. The police file on Malcolm and David Carter was officially marked runaway after 2 weeks. Deputy Morrison's final report noted that the mother's story was inconsistent and unsupported by evidence, and that the children would likely return home when they got hungry enough. But they never came home. And as the months turned to years, Loretta Carter transformed from a vibrant young mother into a broken woman haunted by questions that had no answers. She never stopped believing that somewhere, somehow, her boys were alive and waiting for her to find them. What she couldn't know was that Malcolm and David were indeed alive, but they were living under different names, in different homes, believing the lie that their mother had abandoned them. The truth of what happened that chaotic night at St. Mary's Hospital would remain buried for 40 years. Until a young paralegal named Nia Reynolds decided to look more closely at a box of files that everyone else had ignored. On that same chaotic Tuesday night when Loretta's world fell apart, Malcolm Carter sat in a sterile hospital room, holding his unconscious brother's hand and wondering why their mother hadn't come yet. The antibiotics had finally broken David's fever, but the 7-year-old was still weak and confused. "Where's Mama?" David whispered, his voice hoarse from dehydration. Malcolm squeezed his little brother's fingers. "She'll be here soon. Maybe the roads are bad or something." But deep down, a cold fear was growing in his 9-year-old chest. Mama had promised to come first thing in the morning, and the sun was already setting again. What Malcolm didn't know was that during the overwhelming chaos of the previous night, a catastrophic clerical error had occurred. Nurse Patricia Williams, exhausted after working a double shift during the virus outbreak, had grabbed the wrong transfer forms when the boys were moved from the emergency room to the children's ward. In her fatigue, she had mixed up their paperwork with 2 other unidentified children who had been found abandoned near the highway. The transfer slip that should have read, "Malcolm and David Carter contact, Loretta Carter, Millfield, GA," instead read, "Unknown male child A and unknown male child B, no guardian listed, transfer to state custody pending investigation." By Wednesday morning, when the hospital's overworked social services coordinator arrived, the boys had already been processed as unidentified wards of the state. Their original intake forms had been misfiled in the chaos, and with no identification on either child, the hospital staff made the assumption that haunted families across the South. These were abandoned children whose parents didn't want them. "Boys, we're going to take you somewhere safe," said Mrs. Helen Kowalski, a tired-looking social worker with kind eyes but too many cases. "There's a nice facility where you can stay while we figure out what to do next." Malcolm's heart hammered in his chest. "But our Mama is coming. She promised. We live in Millfield with Mama Loretta. She works at the textile factory." Mrs. Kowalski exchanged a glance with the nurse. She'd heard similar stories from dozens of abandoned children, elaborate fantasies about parents who were coming back, detailed descriptions of homes that existed only in their imaginations. "Sweetie, I know this is scary, but sometimes parents can't take care of their children anymore. That doesn't mean you boys did anything wrong." Her voice was gentle but firm. "We're going to find you a good home where people will love you." David began to cry, and Malcolm pulled his brother close. "We already have a home. Our Mama loves us. She's probably looking for us right now." But their protests fell on deaf ears. To the overwhelmed system, they were just 2 more black children who needed placement, a tragically common situation in 1970s Georgia. The Riverside Children's Home was a converted mansion surrounded by tall pine trees, about 30 miles from St. Mary's Hospital. It housed nearly 60 children of various ages, most of whom had been removed from abusive homes or abandoned by families who couldn't afford to care for them. During the intake process, another devastating error occurred. The staff member filling out the paperwork misheard the boys' names in their soft, scared whispers. Malcolm Carter became Michael Turner on the official documents, and David Carter became Daniel Turner. The intake worker assumed they were brothers with the last name Turner, a reasonable mistake that would prove irreversible. "Michael and Daniel Turner," the facility director, Mr. Raymond Hayes, said as he reviewed their files. "Ages 9 and 7, no known relatives, found at hospital with no identification. We'll place them in our foster-to-adopt program." Within weeks, Malcolm and David, now officially Michael and Daniel Turner, had been separated. The facility's policy was to place siblings together when possible, but the demand for adoptive families far exceeded the supply, and single-child placements were easier to arrange. Malcolm, now calling himself Michael because the adults insisted that was his real name, was placed with the Hendersons, a childless couple in their 40s who ran a small farm outside Atlanta. Robert and Martha Henderson were decent people who genuinely wanted to help a child, but they had no experience with trauma or the complexities of adoption. "Now, Michael," Martha Henderson said gently on his first night in their farmhouse, "I know you miss your brother, but you're safe here with us. We're going to be your new family. But I want to go home to Mama," Malcolm whispered, tears streaming down his face. Robert Henderson, a man of few words but genuine kindness, sat on the edge of the boy's bed. "Son, I know this is hard to understand, but sometimes parents, sometimes they can't keep their children. It doesn't mean they didn't love you. But you've got to look forward now, not backward. 70 miles away, David, now Daniel Turner, had been placed with the Williams family in Savannah. James and Ruth Williams already had 3 children of their own but felt called to adopt. Ruth, a kindergarten teacher, recognized the signs of a traumatized child immediately. "Danny, honey, do you remember anything about your life before?" she asked gently one evening as she tucked him into bed. 7-year-old David's memories were fragmentary and fading. "I had a big brother," he said uncertainly. And there was someone who sang to me. But I can't remember her face." Ruth's heart broke for the confused little boy. "Well, you have big brothers and sisters here now. We're your family, and we love you very much." As months turned to years, both boys began to adapt to their new lives, though neither ever fully settled. Malcolm, now Michael Henderson, threw himself into farm work and school, becoming a serious, responsible child who rarely smiled. He had vivid dreams about a woman's voice calling his name, but the details grew hazier with each passing year. David, now Daniel Williams, became withdrawn and anxious, clinging to Ruth Williams with desperate intensity. He would sometimes wake up crying for Malcolm, though he couldn't explain who Malcolm was or why the name made him so sad. Both families were loving in their own ways, but neither boy ever shook the feeling that something essential was missing from their lives. They grew up believing their birth mother had abandoned them, though they couldn't understand why that belief felt so wrong. By the time they reached adulthood, Michael Henderson had become a successful construction foreman with a wife and 2 children of his own. Daniel Williams had become a social worker, drawn to help other displaced children, though he never understood why their stories affected him so deeply. Neither man knew that their mother, Loretta Carter, spent every birthday and Christmas alone in her small apartment, setting the table for 3 and waiting for sons who would never walk through her door. And neither could have imagined that somewhere in a dusty storage room, a box of misfiled documents held the key to a reunion that would shock the world. 40 years after that terrible night, 26-year-old Nia Reynolds sat in a cramped law office in downtown Atlanta, surrounded by towers of cardboard boxes that reached nearly to the ceiling. Each box contained decades-old files from the now-defunct Riverside Children's Home, and her job was to sort through them all as part of a massive class-action lawsuit. The lawsuit had been filed by Marcus Thompson, a former resident of Riverside who had suffered years of neglect and abuse at the facility. His legal team was seeking damages not just for Marcus, but for hundreds of other children who had passed through Riverside's doors between 1965 and 1995, when the facility was finally shut down for violations too numerous to count. "This is like archaeological work," Nia muttered to herself, pulling another manila folder from box 47. The papers inside were yellowed with age, some barely legible due to water damage and poor storage conditions. As a paralegal fresh out of community college, this wasn't exactly the glamorous legal work she'd imagined, but it paid the bills and gave her valuable experience. The case had already uncovered horrific evidence of systematic abuse, financial fraud, and record destruction. Many of the facility's files had been deliberately destroyed when state investigators began sniffing around in the early 1990s, but these boxes had been overlooked, stored in a basement storage unit that the facility's administrators had apparently forgotten about. Nia had been working on the case for 3 months, documenting patterns of neglect and building profiles of children who had been failed by the system. But it was the transfer documents that fascinated her most, hastily scrawled forms that showed how children arrived at Riverside and where they went next. On a rainy Thursday morning in November 2010, Nia opened box 52 and found something that made her pause. Unlike most of the transfer slips she'd seen, this one had 2 different sets of handwriting. The original entry, written in blue ink, read, "Malcolm and David Carter, ages 9 and 7, transfer from St. Mary's Regional Hospital, awaiting placement, contact Mother, Loretta Carter, Millfield, GA." But that information had been crossed out with red ink, and new information had been written below it. "Michael and Daniel Turner, ages 9 and 7, known family, permanent placement authorized." Nia frowned at the document. Why would someone cross out one set of information and replace it with completely different names? She'd seen clerical corrections before, but this looked like an entirely different case. Her curiosity piqued. She began digging deeper into Box 52. 20 minutes later, she found adoption records for both Michael Turner and Daniel Turner, dated just 6 weeks after their arrival at Riverside. The adoption files listed their birth dates as July 15, 1961, and March 3, 1963, exactly matching the dates on the original Carter transfer slip. "That's weird," Nia murmured, making photocopies of both documents. Same birth dates, same ages, same arrival date at the facility, but completely different names and family histories. Over her lunch break, instead of heading to the cafeteria, Nia found herself at her computer, searching public records databases. It didn't take long to find Michael Henderson in Atlanta. The adoption records showed he'd been placed with Robert and Martha Henderson in 1971. A quick Google search revealed that Michael was now a construction foreman, married with 2 children. Daniel Williams was slightly harder to track down, but Nia eventually found him working as a social worker in Savannah. According to his LinkedIn profile, he specialized in helping displaced children find permanent homes, a career choice that now seemed remarkably poignant given what Nia suspected about his own story. But it was her next search that made Nia's hands tremble as she typed. Loretta Carter, Millfield, Georgia. The first result was an obituary from 2009. Loretta Carter, age 64, had died alone in a nursing home, preceded in death by her beloved sons, Malcolm and David Carter, who disappeared in 1970. The obituary mentioned that she had never given up hope of finding her children and had spent her final years asking nurses and visitors if they had any news about 2 little boys who had gone missing decades ago. Nia stared at the screen, her heart racing. If her suspicions were correct, Loretta Carter had died just 1 year ago, still believing her sons were lost forever, while those same sons were living full lives less than 200 miles away from where she had spent her final days. She immediately called her supervising attorney, Jennifer Walsh, who listened with growing amazement as Nia explained her discovery. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Jennifer asked. "Because if you're right, this isn't just about our lawsuit anymore. This is about 2 men who have been living with stolen identities for 40 years. I'm not certain yet, but the circumstantial evidence is compelling. The dates all match perfectly, and the original transfer slip clearly shows their real names and their mother's contact information." Nia paused, looking at the photocopied documents spread across her desk. "There's one way to know for sure. DNA testing? DNA testing. If Michael Henderson and Daniel Williams are really Malcolm and David Carter, a paternity test with their mother's DNA should prove it definitively." Jennifer was quiet for a long moment. "Nia, do you understand what you might be uncovering here? If these men really are the Carter brothers, then we're looking at one of the most devastating cases of bureaucratic negligence in modern history. 2 children were literally erased from existence because of clerical errors." "I know. And their mother died thinking they were finished." Nia's voice was thick with emotion. "But Jennifer, they're both still alive. Malcolm is 49 years old and David is 47. They have families of their own now. Doesn't that count for something?" Jennifer made her decision quickly. "I'm going to contact both men. This goes way beyond our current case, but if there's even a chance you're right, they deserve to know the truth about who they really are." That afternoon, Jennifer Walsh made 2 phone calls that would change 3 lives forever. The conversations were brief and awkward. How do you tell a middle-aged man that everything he believes about his identity might be a lie? Both Michael and Daniel agreed to meet with the legal team, though neither fully understood why. Michael drove down from Atlanta, while Daniel made the trip from Savannah. Neither man knew that his brother would be sitting in the same conference room for the first time in 40 years. The reunion that was about to unfold would capture the attention of the entire nation and expose a tragic flaw in America's child welfare system. But more importantly, it would finally answer the question that had haunted 3 people for 4 decades. What happened to Malcolm and David Carter on that terrible night in 1970? The conference room at Walsh and Associates felt unusually quiet as Michael Henderson sat across from Daniel Williams, both men studying each other with a mixture of confusion and inexplicable recognition. Neither had been told why the other was there, only that they were part of an investigation involving their childhood records. "Gentlemen," Jennifer Walsh began, her voice careful and measured. "What I'm about to tell you may be difficult to believe, but we have compelling evidence that suggests you are not who you think you are." Michael, a broad-shouldered man with graying temples, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand. My name is Michael Henderson. I've been Michael Henderson for 39 years. Daniel, smaller and more nervous, nodded in agreement. "And I'm Daniel Williams. I was adopted as a young child, but my family has all the proper paperwork." Jennifer placed 2 photocopied documents on the table between them. "These are transfer records from Riverside Children's Home, dated 1970. The original entries show 2 brothers named Malcolm and David Carter, ages 9 and 7, who were transferred from St. Mary's Regional Hospital to await placement." Michael leaned forward, his construction worker hands trembling slightly as he picked up the papers. "Malcolm and David," he whispered, and Daniel's head snapped up at the sound. "Those names." Daniel's voice was barely audible. "I used to have dreams about someone calling me David. And Malcolm. I don't know why, but hearing that name makes my chest hurt." Jennifer continued gently. "The original information was crossed out and replaced with Michael and Daniel Turner. We believe there was a clerical error at the hospital, followed by additional mistakes at the children's home. Your birth dates match exactly with the Carter brothers." For several moments, the room was silent except for the sound of Daniel's quiet crying. Michael stared at the documents, his mind racing back to fragmented memories he'd spent decades trying to forget. "There was a woman," Michael said suddenly. "In my dreams, there's always a woman with a soft voice who calls me Malcolm. And she sings this song about mockingbirds." His voice cracked. "I thought it was just my imagination." Daniel looked up through his tears. "You remember the song too? About the mockingbird not singing and the diamond ring?" His voice rose with excitement and disbelief. "I've been humming that song my whole life, but I never knew where I learned it." The DNA results came back 3 days later, confirming what their hearts had already begun to accept. Michael Henderson was indeed Malcolm Carter, and Daniel Williams was David Carter. After 40 years of separation, the brothers were finally in the same room again. The story broke on CNN first, then spread like wildfire across every major news network. "Missing brothers found after 40 years" dominated headlines around the world. The human interest angle was irresistible. 2 successful men discovering they were brothers who had been ripped apart by bureaucratic errors decades earlier. But the most heartbreaking revelation was yet to come. During a live interview on Good Morning America, Jennifer Walsh shared the discovery that had brought Nia Reynolds to tears in her research. "What makes this story particularly tragic," Jennifer told the stunned hosts, "is that the boys' mother, Loretta Carter, never stopped looking for them. She died in a nursing home in 2009, still asking about her missing sons until her final days." The camera captured the exact moment when Malcolm and David learned their mother had died, the raw grief on their faces as they realized they had missed her by just 1 year. The footage became one of the most watched clips in television history. "She never gave up on us," Malcolm whispered, his voice breaking. "For 40 years, she believed we were out there somewhere." David wiped his eyes with shaking hands. "All this time, we both thought she had abandoned us. But she was looking for us the whole time." The nursing home where Loretta had spent her final years provided additional heartbreaking details. Staff members recalled how she would show everyone photographs of 2 young boys, asking if they had seen Malcolm and David. She had kept their bedroom exactly as it was in 1970, waiting for them to come home. The brothers requested to visit their mother's grave immediately. News cameras followed them to the modest cemetery in Millfield, Georgia, where Loretta Carter was buried under a simple headstone that read, "Beloved mother still waiting for her boys." Malcolm knelt beside the grave and placed his hand on the cool marble. "Mama, we're here. We're finally here. I'm sorry it took us so long to find you." David joined his brother, laying a bouquet of wildflowers on their mother's resting place. "We never forgot you, Mama. Deep down, we always knew someone was missing from our lives." The footage of the two middle-aged men crying at their mother's grave became a symbol of both devastating loss and miraculous recovery. Social media exploded with support for the brothers, and donations poured in to help them rebuild their relationship and honor their mother's memory. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Malcolm and David stood together at a press conference, facing a room full of reporters and cameras. "We want people to understand," Malcolm said, his arm around his younger brother's shoulders, "that families can be destroyed by simple mistakes. But they can also be rebuilt by people who care enough to ask the right questions." Daniel nodded, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "Our mother never gave up hope. Now it's our turn to make sure no other family goes through what we went through." The Carter brothers had found each other at last, but their journey was far from over. The healing that lay ahead would require rebuilding not just their relationship with each other, but also their understanding of who they truly were after 4 decades of living as different people. 2 years after their reunion, Malcolm and David Carter sat in the study of Malcolm's Atlanta home, surrounded by boxes of photographs, documents, and handwritten notes. The manuscript for their book, Erased but Not Lost, lay spread across the desk between them, nearly 400 pages chronicling their incredible journey from separation to redemption. "You know what still gets to me?" David said, holding up a faded photograph of their mother from 1969. "Look at how young she was. She was only 25 when we were taken from her, and she spent the rest of her life searching for us." Malcolm nodded, his finger tracing the edge of another photo, this one showing him and David building a snowman in their backyard that last winter before everything changed. "Sometimes I wonder what kind of men we would have become if we'd grown up with her. If we'd grown up together." The writing process had been therapeutic but painful. Both brothers had undergone counseling to help them process not just the trauma of separation, but the complex emotions of discovering their entire identities had been built on a foundation of clerical errors. Malcolm struggled with anger at the system that had failed them, while David battled guilt over the life their mother had lived while they thrived in adoptive homes. Their book became a bestseller within weeks of publication, climbing to number 1 on the New York Times list and staying there for months. But more importantly, it sparked a national conversation about child welfare reform that reached the highest levels. The most significant change came in the form of the Carter Family Protection Act, landmark legislation that Malcolm and David had personally lobbied for in Washington, D.C. The law mandated that no child could be placed in state custody without strict identity verification protocols, including fingerprinting, DNA collection, and mandatory waiting periods to allow for family reunification. "This law ensures that what happened to us can never happen to another family," Malcolm testified before Congress, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Every child deserves to know who they are and where they come from." The legal victory was sweet, but the personal healing proved more complex. Both brothers had to navigate the delicate process of integrating their newly discovered identities with the lives they had already built. Malcolm's wife, Sandra, and their twin daughters struggled at first with calling him by his birth name, while David's relationship with his adoptive family, the Williamses, became strained as he embraced his Carter identity. The breakthrough came during a family gathering that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The Hendersons, the Williamses, Malcolm's wife and children, and David's partner all came together at the house in Millfield that Malcolm had purchased and restored, the same house where he and David had lived with their mother 43 years earlier. "This feels right," David said as he stood in what had once been their shared bedroom. The walls were now painted bright yellow instead of the faded blue he barely remembered, but something about the room's dimensions felt familiar, like muscle memory awakening after decades of sleep. Ruth Williams, David's adoptive mother, wiped tears from her eyes as she watched him explore the space. "I always knew there was a sadness in you that we couldn't reach," she said softly. "I'm glad you finally found your way home." The Carter Brothers Foundation became their most ambitious project yet. Using proceeds from their book sales and speaking engagements, they created a nonprofit organization dedicated to reuniting separated families and reforming child welfare practices nationwide. Their first major success came when they helped reunite Maria Santos with her daughter, who had been lost in the foster care system for 8 years due to a similar clerical error. The footage of Maria collapsing in tears as she embraced her teenage daughter became almost as famous as the Carter brothers' own reunion. "Every family we bring back together honors our mother's memory," David explained during a television interview. "Loretta Carter never gave up hope, and now we're making sure other parents don't have to give up either." The foundation's offices were located in a renovated building in downtown Millfield, just blocks from where their mother had once posted flyers with their photographs. A bronze plaque in the lobby read, "In memory of Loretta Carter, a mother's love never dies." On the 5th anniversary of their reunion, Malcolm and David returned to their mother's grave with their families. The simple headstone had been replaced with a larger memorial that included space for both brothers when their time came. "We used to be Malcolm and David Carter, then we became Michael Henderson and Daniel Williams," Malcolm said as he placed fresh flowers on the grave. "But we were always your sons, Mama. And we always will be." David knelt beside his brother, his hand resting on the warm marble. "We found our way back to each other, and we found our way back to you. The circle is complete." Their story had shocked the world, exposed systemic failures, and changed laws that would protect countless children. But in the end, it was simply the story of a family's unbreakable bond, a bond that survived 4 decades of separation, bureaucratic indifference, and the cruelest twist of fate imaginable. The Carter brothers had been erased from official records, but they had never truly been lost. Love, it turned out, was stronger than paperwork, deeper than identity, and more enduring than time itself. Their mother's faith had been vindicated, their brotherhood restored, and their legacy secured for generations of families who would never have to wonder what happened to their missing children. In the end, they had come home.